Hi everyone, this is Jason Edelman, and in this video, we're going to look at providing an introduction to using the iOS config module in Ansible. I've received a lot of questions over the past several months with just getting started with Ansible and how to perform basic operations with Ansible, such as configuring SNMP, configuring VLANs, NTP, and different features like that. So in this video, we're going to focus on the basics just to show how to get started. What I mean is, we're not going to configure complex configurations or complex features. We're going to start with the bare minimum required in order to show how to configure SNMP contact, location, and community strings with the Ansible iOS config module. So we're going to be focused on specifically global configuration commands. Now, I'll emphasize that because the way we're going to configure commands that are in interface configuration mode, router configuration mode, and different modes like that will be slightly different. So again, we're focused more on architecture and more on seeing the different mechanisms that can be used within Ansible to configure a Cisco iOS device. Now, what we're going to do first is do a tree command within Linux. We're going to see we have no Ansible files yet. We simply have a single directory with a single file. If we cat this file, we'll see we have 5 commands. This is the desired configuration that we want to have on our Cisco iOS XE device. We're going to open this in Sublime just so we could keep this open and reference this file. So this file is now open, and we're going to expand our configs on the left just to see all of our configurations that we're going to have, which for now is just our snmp.cfg file. We have 2 routers available to us. We have CSR1 and CSR2. These are Cisco Cloud Services routers. We're going to clear that out. We're now going to open and create the inventory file that we're going to use within Ansible. We're going to call these our iOS devices. We're going to have CSR1, CSR2. We're now going to create group variables in Ansible. Again, this video isn't going to go into super detail around the underlying Ansible architecture, so it does assume some level of understanding creating group variables and inventory files. We're going to be focused on just the usage of the iOS config module within Ansible. We're going to create some credentials in our group variables. We'll say NTC. We'll say password equals NTC123. We're going to do Control-S on this. We'll save it, and then we'll see it populate on the left-hand side. Now what we're going to do is we'll just call a playbook config.yml, and this will be our Ansible playbook that we're going to use in order to deploy and configure SNMP on our Cisco routers. And we have 2 files here. So inventory is a single group called iOS and 2 devices in there. So now we're going to get started. Our playbook's the YAML file, so we'll have our 3 hyphens at the top. This is our first play in the playbook. So what we're going to say is name. So we're going to say deploy SNMP commands from file. So we're going to show this a few different ways. Our first one will be from file. Actually, we're going to change this. We're going to say deploy SNMP configurations. We'll do this a different way. We'll say configurations. What hosts do we want to deploy this on? So we'll say both iOS devices and our group called iOS in our inventory file. So we'll say host iOS. And we're going to be explicit. It's always good just getting started. We're going to disable gather facts. We're going to say no. Otherwise, we'd be gathering facts on our local server. So we're going to run in connection local mode. We're running Ansible 2.2. So we're going to make sure we run in local mode, which is how all the majority of networking modules work at this point. So we now need to add our tasks to our playbook. Our first task will be deploy SNMP configs from file. Actually, you know what we're going to do first is deploy SNMP commands. We want to minimize dependencies. We're going to deploy SNMP commands within our playbook. This is where we're going to introduce the iOS config module. Well, how do we get started here with the config module? We'll simply browse Ansible Docs Online. or we can use the Ansible doc utility. This is going to show us all the required parameters that we need and some examples at the bottom on how to get started. So we can see here, there's different mechanisms that we're going to be seeing. So we can look at lines. Lines as an example, if we scroll up to see what lines are going to be the commands that we want. Another alias for lines is commands. So I prefer commands, so we're going to use commands on here. This is a parameter called commands, which accepts a single command or a list. So we're going to say our list of commands that we want to deploy at this point, this is going to be our list. Okay. So we're going to copy our commands in here. We're going to use a few Sublime shortcuts. Control-Shift-L, multi-line edit. We're going to create our list. Then we're going to add our commands into our task. We now need our credentials. We're going to say username, or a variable we're going to reference from our inventory file, UN, password, PWD. That's the variable that we have in our inventory file. And we have our commands, username, password, and we need our host currently. This is going to be inventory hostname, built-in variable that references the name of the host as we've defined in the inventory file. We have CSR1, CSR2. Those are both resolvable names, so we can just reference those names. And at this point, let's do Control-S on our playbook. This is our desired SMP configuration. We can exit out of here. We do an ls. We now see we have our configs directory still there with our desired commands, our config playbook, config.yml, and our inventory file. So if we want to run this playbook, we can say Ansible playbook -i inventory and config.yaml. So this is saying run our playbook config.yaml and reference our inventory file. So here, we'll go back to our playbook. We see hosts:ios. Hosts:ios is in fact referencing the iOS group. So we're going to automate both hosts. Since we don't want to do both hosts just yet, we're going to limit this job to just CSR1 to ensure it's going to work properly. So when we run our playbook, this is going to fail. It's template error while templating string unexpected string, PWD. All right, so we'll get some real-time troubleshooting here. We come back in here, we notice I did forget a curly brace. Maybe that was on purpose, maybe it wasn't. Okay, so we're going to come back, do Control-S, come back to our Linux terminal, run our playbook again. So we now see our play name, our task name, and we're now going to see this changed as amber. So if we wanted to open a new window up, we can simply, for now we'll do a new tab. We'll say SSH into CSR1. We'll log into this device. And if we do a show run pipe include SNMP server, we will now see our commands on the device. And just to show the item potency of this module, meaning the change will not occur again if we run the same playbook. This is green OK, no change was made. Okay, so this module will only make the change the first time. So we can run this over and over again, and the change will only occur the first iteration. But the nice thing is, we now prove this out. CSR1 is our canary device, our test device. We can get rid of our limit, run this on both devices in parallel, CSR1, CSR2, because Ansible is natively concurrent. So now it says, OK, CSR1. The config already existed on CSR1. Now it says change CSR2. So now if we log into CSR2, that would be good as well. And if we want to just prove item potency one more time, we'll run our playbook. And now we're going to see green OK for both CSR1 and CSR2. This is showing one way to get started using the iOS config module. We're going to copy this. We're going to paste this down here. We have commands again. Now we want to show another way. We're going to say another way we can say just reference configs snmp.cfg. This is going to show us how to deploy directly from a config file. So we deploy snmp commands from config file. This is where if you just want to put your commands in a file, go for it, and we can reference that file from a single task. But we also notice you can have multiple tasks in a playbook. We see username, password, host, username, password, host, a little bit redundant. So what we're going to do now is we're going to simply define a variable in our playbook at the top. Ideally, this would get moved into a group vars file, but just to show a good practice on building a variable in your playbook, prove it out first. So we're going to call this our iOS provider. This is going to provide our redundant variables such as username, password, and host. So we're just going to take those out, paste them at the top. We're going to use our typical good practice 2-space indent. Now we would just reference that variable with the provider variable. Okay, so we're now going to pass in iOS provider as the value of the provider parameter. Now, just for a quick look at this, if we want to see this on Ansible doc iOS config, we scroll down, look for provider. Provider is a convenience method. As you see, it wasn't required, but it was a convenience method. Going forward, after 2.2, you will have to start using provider. But for now, it's a convenience mechanism to simplify common arguments between tasks. We'll clear this out. So we're now going to do Control S. We're going to run both tasks, and they should be idempotent for both because all this configuration already exists on the networking devices. So this is a little bit redundant, but we're showing the different mechanisms we can use the iOS config module. So we can have our commands embedded in a playbook. We can reference a file. We can also reference what's called a Jinja 2 template. Now, if we look at this, we can copy and paste this to deploy SNMP commands directly from a Jinja 2 template. So this can say source. We're now going to reference a snmp.j2 file. This is a Jinja 2 template. Ansible automatically looks for templates stored in the templates directory. So we're going to create that. And then we're going to say, let's open up templates snmp.j2. Okay. So we're going to expand this. We're going to show that down here. We're going to migrate to our 2-pane column layout. We're going to have our template over here, and we're going to reference this template as well. So we want to show our configuration. And this is where we need to decouple our inputs and our outputs. So we're going to also open up another new file. We're going to call group vars. And for now, all these variables accessible to all devices. So we're just going to save this as all.yaml. And we can actually, if we want, for good practice, we're going to remove our provider from our playbook. We're going to put that directly in our group vars file. We're going fairly quick here just in the interest of time. So we're now going to show what this is like. We now have a variable in our all.yaml file in group vars. These variables are available for any device to use. Consider them defaults if you want. We'll clear. And so we're on the playbook if we want. This is just proving out that the playbook still works after we migrated and moved the provider into our group vars file. So, and this failed because we don't have our template yet. Okay, so that was a good failure because our task in our playbook had referenced a template that was not yet usable. So what we need to do is create variables that reference everything we need from our config. We're going to copy this temporarily so we can see this all on screen. So we're going to say we want to create a variable called SNMP, and there's no right or wrong way to model data. Interest of this video, we're going to pick one way. So we're going to say SNMP. We're going to have this be a dictionary. SNMP contact is going to be JSON E. We're going to say our location is the data we want this to be. And now we want to have this be RO. We'll say RO community strings. We'll say public 123. Another one called network to code. And then we'll say RW. Keep this simple. We have a nested list rather than do list of dictionaries with type keys and things like that. So we're just going to show it one way here, RW, and this is going to be private 123. All right, so now we'll keep that there. We're going to do Control S. Now we need a Jinja2 template to consume this data. So now one option, or the option that we're going to show, is our first contact command. So this is going to be our template, SNMP server community. Then we need expand this over. So the first one will be contact, SNMP server contact. This is going to be SNMP dot contact. So SNMP, the first one, is referencing our variable name, and we can do dot key, so dot contact. Location will be the same. Sold SNMP dot location. Change this to location. Now we need two for loops to loop over RO and RW. Again, this is one way to model the data simply. Otherwise, typically we would have community strings be a list of dictionaries and change the data, have a single for loop. Or we'll save that as an exercise for the video watcher. Now we're going to show we could also do for RO community in SNMP dot RO. Now this is going to be SNMP server community. Access our variable RO community, and then put RO. We have to end our for loop, and we're going to copy this one and have it one more time for the RW communities. Little typo there, we'll come back and grab that one. So we'll do RW, RW, RW. This is a Jinja2 template accessing the data in our variables files to generate these commands. Okay, so now what we could do is delete this. We've decoupled our commands into data, our YAML variables, and a template. When we insert our data into our template, we're going to have rendered commands. So if we're going to adopt good practices to leverage platforms like GitHub to store our variables files, you would do a pull request in, modify SNMP data, render that with our template and our playbook, and then out comes our commands. So this is going to be 3 ways to do the same exact thing. So this is going to be redundant and deploy the same commands 3 separate times. So we're going to run this our first 2 times again. Task 1, we already know this works, doing the same exact thing. We're now deploying directly from a config file. We're now sourcing a Jinja2 template in the config file. And we actually saw a change here. So what we want to do is really see what's going on here with why this is changing is let's try something here where we want to run just this one task. So we can tag it, and we'll call this SNMP J2. That's our tag. So we can just run minus tags SNMP .J2 in verbose mode. Let's see if this shows us any data. So this did not make a change because it already made the change. we have to figure out why this had a different attribute on here. So we'll say public 123, private network to code, public 123, private 123, network to code, JSON-E, NTC, HQ, and NYC. So what we could do if we want to configure this, we'll come back to our device. We timed out over here, so we'll wait for this to come back to us. Using a template directly. So we're going to come back into our device, show run pipe include SNMP server. The commands do look the same. NTC, HQ, NYC. Okay, so this was why it changed. Okay, so those might have noticed this, but one was JSON-E all underscore or lowercase, one was all caps. This is why it did change. Just to prove this out, make sure we are good actually. Let's change our data to JSON underscore E. We're gonna run our playbook again, all three. The first one will show a change because we're gonna go back to all caps. So we're gonna say changed here, okay, deploying from a config file, deploy commands from agent2 template. Now we're good. So we saw this perfect. So now we're going to introduce our last way, which is going to be generate SNMP config file using the template module. So we can source SNMP J2 here. The desk where we want to store this, let's just say this is going to be configs, and then we'll say SNMP auto, since we already have a .cfg, deploy SNMP from auto generated file. At this point, we can copy this previous task, iOS config. So we're going to do configs SNMP -auto, and these two tasks can be used instead of this one task or this other task. Okay, so you have your option here with picking and choosing how they're used. Using the two-step process, I'd consider a common practice since it allows us to build our config files, view them first. For example, we now can say, we'll say build tags deploy. Okay. So let's just run our build task. So we're going to say Ansible playbook -- tags equals build. So this only changed once because we're generating the same commands for two devices or n devices. So technically speaking, this one can be a run once equal true. Now, if you had unique configurations, then you would not have the run once. So we can now run this again. Again, the build's already done, but it only runs once this time. So if we do a tree here, we're now going to see SNMP auto. This was auto generated with the template module. So if we say cat configs SNMP auto, we now see our commands in this file. This was auto generated. We verified the commands were auto generated properly. We now can just run our deploy task, which is our last task. Again, this is the same configurations we already configured 3 times. So in this short video, we showed 4 different ways that we can simply deploy configurations. Now, option 1, great for getting started. Again, we're just focused on global config commands here. We're not showing yet how you can do interface commands, router BGP commands, router OSPF commands, quality of service. Anything not in global configuration mode would be a little bit more complex, a little bit more into using the config module, we would have to look at other parameters such as parents as an example. So feel free to browse the Ansible docs or use the Ansible-doc utility to understand how to use the iOS config module or other config modules such as NXOS config, EOS config, GNOS config, and so on. So what we're going to look at, again, is our goal was to show how to get started using the iOS config module. So we showed how to embed commands in a playbook. We showed how to reference a config file with you just dumping in the commands in the config file. We showed how to create a Jinja2 template referencing data in our group vars all.yaml file, and any variable in all.yaml in group vars is accessible for all devices. So ours, we had two variables, iOS provider, to simplify credentials, and SNMP, which was our SNMP data. Now, once your template's created, your template should never change. Only your data should change. That was another option. We then said, hey, what if we want to verify our commands in our config file before we do a deploy, if we're going to do this in a proper fashion, potentially having different variables, different data for different sites, because you can have variables for different geographic locations, maybe SNMP settings for Asia Pac or EMEA or the US. But your template could be the same to auto-generate the right commands. So we auto-generate it with the template module and then deploy with the config module. Again, so this is just showing different ways you can get started using the iOS config module to specifically deploy global configuration commands. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out online through Slack. We have a Slack community that you can self-sign up for at slack.network2code.com. That's slack.network2code.com. There's various channels available. Feel free to reference this video and we can help dynamically online, or email us as well. You can email us at info@network2code.com as well. And again, hope this helps get started with Ansible using the iOS config module.